after Pup became a big hit, the team at Humongous Entertainment naturally wanted to follow up on it, which they did with not just a sequel, but also another original adventure game, that being Fatty Bear's Birthday Surprise in March of 1993. However, while it did decently with critics and in sales, it didn't reach the same level of popularity as Pup, and the company would have had to pay royalties if they wanted to do more games with the character. So, with the bear not being as popular as the car, what would be their second Junior Adventure series? Well, for that, they'd have to stop looking in a child's toy box and instead take a dive under the sea to find their next Junior Adventure series, Freddi Fish. The series revolves around Freddi, a young goldfish, and her best friend Luther. Together, they solve various mysteries happening across the ocean. Whether it's a haunted schoolhouse, the theft of a precious conch shell, a missing kelp seed treasure, or locating a sea monster, they'll do what they can to solve each mystery. But it isn't always easy for them, as they encounter various obstacles and foes while also searching for clues and gathering the necessary items they'll need in order to solve each case. Basically, imagine if Nancy Drew or Carmen Sandiego were a 6-year-old kid detective that just so happened to be a goldfish. The idea for the project first originated when one crew member, Brad Carlton, drew a short comic strip called Ted's Eyeballs, featuring two fish called Ed and Fred. And yes, you heard it correctly, Freddi was originally a male fish. Together with Ron Gilbert and writer Larry Kay, they proceeded to flesh out the story of the first Fred Fish game. But the project wouldn't fully take shape until one other person came on board. Enter game designer Tammy Borowick. When she joined the team, she made one suggestion that would completely change the course of the game. Change Fred from a boy to a girl. The reason she advocated for this change was because she wanted to upend the very persistent feeling in the game industry that girls would play boy characters, but boys would not play girl characters. However, it had one major hurdle. When she asked Kay to make the changes, he also added in new dialogue for Freddi, like, "Oh, that's too hard to do," whenever she was confronted with a difficult puzzle. Unfortunately and sadly at the time, depicting a girl character as being feeble and weak was the norm for many games. However, Borowick pushed back on adding in lines like that, feeling that they undercut Freddi's character, so they all got taken out. Thank goodness for that, because both the character and the series probably wouldn't have been as fondly looked upon if those lines had remained in. When the game first began production, it was originally being developed for the MS-DOS, much like Fatty Bear and the first two Pup games, as can be seen in these screenshots from a rarely seen proto-demo. It was about halfway through production, but then one event occurred that would forever change not just the game's overall direction, but also the entire future of Humongous Entertainment. In 1994, Ron Gilbert was attending a gaming conference where he saw an executive from another kids game company presenting their new game, showing that it was being made using hand-drawn art and animation on paper as opposed to pixels. It was at that moment it dawned on Gilbert that with this new development, it suddenly made what they were doing look old-fashioned and dated. So he decided that would be the direction their games were going from then on. But there was one little catch. Very few members in the company's crew were trained to do traditional hand-drawn animation. But that didn't stop them from giving it a shot, as they eagerly leapt at the opportunity. It also came at a fortunate time as well, since they were gearing up to upgrade from the MS-DOS to Windows 95. After the decision was made, the first thing the team did was scrap all of the original art that had been previously done and start it all over again. but they kept the overall story and game design intact. From there, they made new fully hand-painted backgrounds that were much bigger and detailed. Then, those backgrounds were scanned in, cleaned up, and rendered in a different aspect ratio. Before then, depending on which series it was, the backgrounds were done in either markers or were painted digitally. Next, they brought on board an animator, the late Louis Scarborough, to help the team get a better idea of how traditional cartoons were done, as well as teaching them about ink and painters, so the animators could concentrate on what they did best. They also began hiring clip point artists, since prior to this, the animators used to do it all themselves. As a result, their project teams went from being just 10 on Putt-Putt Goes to the Moon to around 60 with Freddi Fish. On a side note, they only had one project lead for the entire game, and that was Tammy Borwick. So you can imagine it was a pretty tough task to do. So with all of that, the first Freddi Fish game was born. Oh, and if you're curious if Putt-Putt Saves the Zoo started out the same way, no. It was made for Windows 95 right from the start of production. Now, I've already broken down how the games get made in the Putt-Putt video, so what I said there applies here and for the rest. Anyways, it's time to get on with the show. In the first game, The Case of the Missing Kelp Seeds, Freddi learns that Grandma Grouper's kelp seed treasure has been stolen, and if it isn't recovered soon, the entire ocean's food supply will be gone and all the fish will die. And no, they don't dance around it. They straightforwardly say they will die right at the start.
We need to find Grandma Grouper's treasure chest because that's where the kelp seeds are. If we don't find them soon, all the fish are going to die.
So now, it's up to Freddi and Luther to find and follow the clues left in bottles and get the location of the kelp seed treasure before it's too late. As the first game in the series, it's a pretty good way to get the series started. It's a pretty simple mystery adventure, but it's plenty of fun, has some good and funny moments, is charming, and can actually get a little suspenseful at certain points. The team also did a good job at introducing players to the world and the characters, setting up the mystery and where everything is laid out. Some of the puzzles are cleverly put together and require a bit of creative problem solving. The characters are charming, fun, and colorful, though a couple might come off grating to some, and the antagonists make for some humorous villains.
The bottle ain't here, boss. Maybe somebody else found it first.
Maybe somebody else found it first. Of course someone else found it first, you spongehead!
The gameplay here is fairly simple and straightforward. You go around finding the clues and collecting the necessary items needed to help further progress through the game. One nice touch they added was giving the option to rescue some of the side characters, and if the player does so, they'll make an appearance at the end of the game. There's also some fun side sections. The feeding animals and the pearls in the oyster minigame work in bringing relief to some players. The theater is another fun side section, with the various performances the fish put on. Another minigame worth mentioning is Mr. Starfish's math quiz. It's exactly what the name says. You do a series of math questions based on the difficulty you set it to and correctly answer them. Also, one can do it for as long as they want to. It's pretty much the most educational part of the game, though it probably did help some kids out with math. The backgrounds are very lavishly detailed and work well in invoking that naturalistic ocean feel, while also making it feel big, as well as getting creative with some of the locations. As for the character designs and animation, while they are a bit rough around the edges, it's still pretty smooth, and having some background bubbles popping up occasionally is a nice detail. It also has a slightly darker atmosphere compared to the other games, since it does take place around late afternoon, early evening, and it does carry the burden of the entire fish population's fate resting in the character's fins, even though obviously no one actually ends up dying in the game. As for the actual mystery itself, it's decently set up, and having the bottles being in different locations adds to its replayability, as well as how one goes about retrieving them using the items they've collected along the way. However, it could have been built up and interconnected better, which leads into some of the flaws. For one, as this was the very first Humongous Entertainment game to be fully animated and hand-drawn, there are numerous times where the characters would go off model, even more so than in Putt Putt Saves the Zoo. However, this is forgivable, since again, this was the first game animated like this, and the team was just getting used to it. Also, they hadn't yet learned to put together character model sheets, so each animator would draw the characters in their own style. Next, there are the way the items are laid out. Now, as I already said, they are necessary for solving the puzzles and advancing to the next part of the game. The problem is, there are some items that aren't needed for a specific path, and by having them all available at once, it ends up rendering many of them useless, and the player will end up with items they didn't need to get by the end. Good examples, the amount of purple sea urchins collected, and the glowing shell. Also, there's the whole having arrow signs on almost every screen bit. Although helpful in making sure younger players don't get lost, it does end up giving the game that holding hand feel. Lastly, there's how the whole conflict gets resolved. Now, it's not terrible in the slightest, and it does have a decent moral, that it's better to share the wealth with others rather than hogging it all to oneself. But it gets resolved a bit too easily and quickly. I mean, all Freddi does is suggest to the sharks that they all share the kelp seeds, while also stating that
The kelp seeds are for everyone.
And they agree to go with it. Boom! The conflict's over and they bring the kelp seeds back to Grandma Grouper. It feels like there should have been a little more added at the end to make it feel more complete. With all that said though, those flaws don't take away from the game's level of fun and enjoyment. And as I said at the start, it's a good beginning for the series. Okay, before we go on, let's briefly talk about the game's demo. What makes this one worth mentioning? Well, for the most part, the puzzle in it is the same as it is in the actual game, with having to free Gabby from under the rocks in the cave. But there are some notable differences. For one, the wooden board is in the area next to the cave instead of being near the beach. Also, Freddi refers to the board as a plank, and it automatically goes into the inventory rather than having either Freddi or Luther picking it up.
It's a wooden plank.
Next, the opening scene is slightly quicker and has some exclusive animation not found in the actual game. Also, there is one composite error when Mrs. Halibut rams into the cave entrance. Finally, for whatever reason, probably to make the demo longer, the old whale bones are part of the cave as opposed to being a separate area, and they even added a small opening and shining light to make it more like an entryway. Also, like before, there are some special lines added in for Freddi.
Gabby's not here, but I'm sure we'll find him if we keep looking.
Some animations of the duo swimming further down through the bones, and they flip the area where Gabby's stuck in to better match the direction they're coming in from. Now, as I've previously stated in the prologue, this is the first Humongous game to have interchangeable game paths. But it should be noted that the Scum engine was always built to support multiple puzzle paths, since it was first designed for Maniac Mansion. Like I said in the Putt Putt video, there are a few elements that do get randomized there. The street you start on first, which apartment floors you go to, baby beep shape and color, etc, etc. Heck, Even Freddi Bear had this by changing up the items' locations. Freddi Fish just so happened to be the first series to implement it for the gamepads. Plus, it makes perfect sense. After all, it is a mystery game series. Giving them just one linear game path with little random bits changed up like Putt-Putt and Freddi Bear had would have made it less replayable and enjoyable. Now, of course, I can't talk about this game without bringing up one of its most well-known hidden Easter eggs.
What you thinking about, Freddi? Oh, nothing, Luther.
This was done by animator Tom Very as a way to just blow off some steam. Honestly, it's a very thankful thing this wasn't in the final game, because they would have received floods of angry letters from parents all about it. But that's not the only notable unused element that didn't make it. There are a couple of clip points that were left out of the final version. One involving a hanging fish skeleton in Mr. Starfish's room, and this seemed to have been a last-minute change, as it can be seen in a couple of pre-release screenshots. And also, if you look real carefully, you can spot an out-of-place cutout in the rocks. The others are on the sunken ship's deck, where there are two animations of the sword's handle coming to life. It's not known why these ones were removed. Also, there are some unused music cues, consisting of one that's nearly identical to another piece, but had tiki-esque chanting in it, which didn't make it due to either not finding the right place for it, or because it slightly plays into some Islander stereotypes. Another one meant for the sunken ship, which may or may not have been done as a possible fallback. But it can't be accessed since the player is locked into that area until the end. Two cues meant for the King's Castle that don't play due to how the game engine handles the music. A variant of one of the background cues, but with vocals.
Freddi, we need your help, please. We need to find the missing kelp seeds. Freddi, we need your help. We need to find the missing kelp.
And the full version of the shark's theme. When Freddi and Luther first got on the case on October 28, 1994, they did a good job solving it. Just good. Critics gave the game mixed reviews, saying that it was a little too easy, the actual mystery being on the weak side, and felt it didn't take full advantage of its underwater setting. But they did give it great praise for the animation, gameplay, the puzzles, and the music. As for the game sales, it did pretty well. In fact, by 1999, it had sold a combined total of 250,000 units, with an additional 54,447 units sold in 2001. Freddi Fish's success would become quite a significant one for the company. Sure, Putt-Putt succeeded in establishing Humongous' presence in the market and getting him off the ground, but Freddi Fish was credited as the one that put their name on the map, and with good reason. At the time, there were very few PC games one could find that featured this kind of quality animation and detailed backgrounds. It was featured on an episode of the PBS show The Computer Chronicles, and was bundled as a bonus with the kids' accessory, the Microsoft Easy Ball. However, what really cemented Freddi's success was when Bill Gates showcased it at the 1994 Condex event in Las Vegas as an example of the capabilities of Windows 95. You know they made it big when Bill Gates gave their game an endorsement. 2 years later, Freddi and Luther would be off to school and get somewhat paranormal for their next case in the case of the haunted schoolhouse. In here, Freddi and Luther are off to school, and today it's show and tell day, with Luther bringing in his favorite action figure. When they arrive, however, they find out that the school is being haunted by a ghost and that said ghost is stealing all of their schoolmates' toys. So they give chase in order to get all of the toys back. But they soon quickly discover that the ghost is nothing more than someone in a costume. So Freddi devises a trap in order to capture him, but it's missing a few items. Thus, Freddi and Luther go all over the area collecting all of the items needed to complete it, while of course helping out others along the way. It's about as much of a Scooby-Doo style mystery as this series is going to get. If I can use one word to describe this game as it is compared to the first one, it'd be crystallized. The team did an amazing job improving nearly every aspect from the first game. Yes, the story and conflict are sillier this time around, the tone is much lighter compared to the first game, and again, the mystery is very Scooby-Doo-like, but it does have more reasonable stakes and also feels much more whole, as the mystery is woven in much better and does a good job at keeping players engaged. We get more insight into why the sharks are after the kids' toys, and both sides do get what they want in the end. There's also plenty of humorous moments.
Hey, Luther, how about giving me a hand?
I really appreciate the great job you're doing. Chocolate-covered worm doodles, my favorite.
Plus, the Rube Goldberg trap at the end was pretty fun to watch. The game also does a great job at further building Freddi Fish's world, bringing in new locations and introducing new characters into the mix, as well as bringing back some from the last one. This is also where the purple sea urchins are firmly established to be a form of currency, as opposed to being used as only ballast like in the first game. This game is also partly a musical, as it has several songs throughout it that only last for a brief time whenever the player clicks on an instrument or a character. But even then, some of them are very peppy and catchy to listen to.
A fish is a creature that lives in the sea. It's charming and handsome.
Exactly like me.
Hey, nanny, nanny, and a hot-cha-cha.
Hey, nanny, nanny, and a hot-cha-cha.
For the gameplay, it has been greatly improved upon, as now the player only collects the items necessary for a specific path, apart from the sea urchins, and it makes sure none of them go unused. Speaking of the paths, it has 8 possible game paths in total, whereas the first one had 7. They also greatly scaled back with the on-screen arrow signs, as there's now only a handful of them and they tell the player where each of the main locations are at. The puzzles this time around were more challenging and required more problem solving, critical thinking, and memorizing. The minigames in this, Crab Invaders, drawing on the chalkboard, and the slide puzzle are very enjoyable, and the latter is necessary in order to get one of the items, though fortunately, the player doesn't have to solve the puzzle in order to get it. The movie theater is another fun little side section, with some funny movie clips.
You gotta have them. Worm doodles. Squishy, squashy worm doodle in all your favorite flavors. Original, chocolate, sea cucumber, lemon, orange, red, and new fat-free. Grab them, because you gotta have them.
And even providing an early glimpse at Spy Fox. As for the character animation, it is much smoother and more fluid, and you can tell the crew started working with model sheets as the character designs received a much needed refinement and polish. Talking of which, the new characters here are fun, colorful, and charming. So all told, you've got yourself a solid follow-up that did a great job in working out many of the kinks of its predecessor. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about this memorable moment from the game.
Well, so it is. You boys will be wanting a combination to the trophy case.
Excuse me, sir, but I'm not a boy. I'm a girl.
There's actually an interesting reason this line was put in. See, not long after the first game came out, some people were confused as to whether Freddi was a boy or a girl, which is understandable seeing as she doesn't have any distinctive feminine characteristics like long eyelashes. Tammy Borowick slipped in that line in order to set the record straight. This was also further cemented in Freddi Fish 5. Coincidentally, similar to Putt Putt, this game marks the only time a human is ever heard in a Freddi Fish game.
I could have sworn I felt a nibble.
This would later be referenced and retconned in Spy Fox 3. Not much in the way of unused elements in this one, but there are plenty of notable bits. For instance, there's a hidden Easter egg where, if one clicks on the globe, a duplicate of the screen will appear on the chalkboard. It can be activated if one inputs this line in the INI files. Another hidden Easter egg is where, if one puts this line in, the ghost scenes will always occur no matter what. For unused graphics, there are several variant cursors for the purple sea urchins, where one could pick up 2 to 5 of them, but they were cut since one can only take one at a time out of the inventory. There's also 2 blank versions of the Vote Freddi for Class Prez and Go Marlins banners, likely done to make it easier for the translators. Interestingly, there's some animation of Freddi and Luther untying Captain Schnitzel, showing that there was originally a rope path where the captain was going to be all tied up, as well as a standalone animation of him just sitting up, but they didn't make it. Next, there's some storyboard drawings of Freddi and Luther talking with Mr. Triplefin, where he's shown smoking a pipe and Freddi and Luther giving an unpleasant reaction. This suggests the character wasn't going to be very friendly, but it was changed for the final game. Then, there's an unused movie clip of the 94-95 Humongous logo, which was probably meant to show before each movie instead of the countdown, but it was cut since this was the first game to debut the more iconic logo, and a couple of toys for the credits. For unused dialogue, there are 6 bits of them. One for when Luther's action figure is being examined, which wouldn't have been possible since it's only seen at the very beginning, which even then it's not clickable, and it's not an inventory item.
It's Luther's Codfish Commando action figure.
2 lines for having 6 or 7 urchins in the inventory, but it isn't possible as only 5 purple sea urchins can be found in the game.
We have 6 purple sea urchins. We have 7 purple sea urchins.
A line for when the sharks are unmasked, which was cut for either just stating the obvious or to avoid being redundant.
It's those sharks.
An alternate line for Freddi after Eddie refuses to give the life preserver.
Sorry, we didn't mean to bother you, sir.
And one for the debug menu when one is trying to add in a 6th urchin.
We have enough sea urchins.
Finally, there's an unused song for Barnacle Bob that didn't make it since the Pulley Emporium only has 4 pulleys in it.
I'll bet there's a neat story behind that pulley.
When the great Titanic sank, leaving its twisted remains, I made my way through the metal debris to find this pulley and chains.
When Freddi and Luther arrived at school on September 10th, 1996, they had no trouble cracking the ghost case. Critics gave the game more praise than the first game, stating that the mystery plot was very involving, while also praising the animation, characters, and musical numbers, and that it works as a very fitting sequel. So with all of that, it should come as no surprise that the game went on to become another big sales winner. Leaping forward 2 years, and Freddi and Luther will be heading to the tropics for their next big case in the case of the stolen conch shell. In this, Freddi and Luther are on vacation and are invited to the Founders Day Festival on behalf of Luther's Uncle Briny. When they arrive, however, they find out Uncle Briny's been put in the slammer. For what, you may ask?
The great conch shell was stolen. The Founders Day Festival can't start without it. Since I'm the grand exalted keeper of the conch, I'm the prime suspect. But I didn't do it.
So now, they have to go across the area investigating, gathering up clues, and locate the 3 golden pipes in order to find the real conch shell thief and prove Uncle Briny's innocence. The plot and mystery this time around is more of a typical caper, with multiple suspects and how and why they each could have done the crime, which works perfectly for Freddi Fish as it allows for plenty of various gameplays. Speaking of which, with the number of locations the golden pipes can possibly be on any given path, the game has a grand total of 8 different paths, creating 18 different possible gameplays. Once more, the gameplay has the player going across the town, gathering up what they need to get the golden pipes, and the locations are some of the most creative ones the series has had so far, and are the most vibrant and colorful as well. Also, it's always great to see more world building being done, and it was nice to see Pelican Sam make his return here. The puzzles here have upped the challenge more than in the first 2, as some are multi-part and have varying levels of difficulty. It also does a good job at shaking things up a bit. Toward the end, Luther gets trapped for trying to steal the jewel, and Freddi has to rescue him or they can't leave the temple. It's unique in that it's the first time only one character, Freddi, does a section solo. The mystery itself was much less predictable, as they've retired the sharks and the squid father in favor of having multiple outcomes, which does a great job at keeping the players on their toes, as they'll never know who the thief will be each time it's played. The mini-games here, the pipe organ, floating fun, the wanted poster, and the tumble tubes are very fun and enjoyable, despite being a bit on the easy side, and 2 of them need to be played in order to get one of the 2 golden pipes. There is also 5 songs in here, and they're all pretty darn catchy, and the stage show is a fun side section. The new characters introduced here are some of the most lively, charming, and colorful bunch in the series, though some of them do play into some stereotypes.
Excuse me, sir, but are you a tailor?
Not just a tailor. I am Pierre the tailor.
The character animation is the most fluid and best looking it's ever been, and the animators did an amazing job with it, as well as adding in little background details, from the bubbles and water ripples to more subtle bits like the red glow emanating out of the volcano, the tunnel's eyes moving, and the flow of the waterfall. All in all, with an engaging caper and some fun characters, this was another solid entry in the series. Now, one note I'd like to add is that the idea of having multiple endings was thought up by Mark Pizer during the making of Freddi Fish 2. They originally wanted to do it for that game, but couldn't as it was too far into production. But they were able to with this, as they built it in right from the start. There's only a handful of unused elements here, but they are rather fascinating. To start with, there are several sets of unused cursors. Like in the last game, there are variants for picking up 2 to 5 purple sea urchins, which once again wouldn't have worked since only 1 urchin can be taken out at a time, and the fact there are only 4 in the whole game. Some for the folder, which was pointless since it's just used to remind the player what's happening. Some for the flashlight and the foreign language phrasebook that don't get used as the former is skipped altogether, and the latter is nothing more than an in-game graphic. And there are cursors for the 3 golden pipes, and even one for 4 of them, which can't be used since the player goes directly to the temple after the 3rd pipe is found, and it's impossible to get 4 golden pipes. Speaking of, there are 3 unused inventory bubbles for the Thief's Bag, along with its own set of cursors, which can't be used anyway.
It's the bag that the Conch thief dropped.
5 sea urchins, which again really wouldn't have worked given there are only 4, and 1 for 4 golden pipes, which doesn't make sense since there are just 3 pipes to find in the game. Finally, there is a handful of unused dialogue. A bit for Luther after putting the jewel back in place.
Now let's get out of here.
5 bits of the other suspects proclaiming, "I did it."
I did it.
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 And 5 for Freddi in the debug screens.
We have enough sea urchins. We have enough golden pipes. Selecting this golden pipe means Nadine can't be the wallet owner. Pierre or Blenny will be chosen instead. You must deselect the surface golden pipe first. You must deselect an urchin first.
When the conch shell was recovered on March 31st, 1998, the duo succeeded in exonerating Uncle Blenny. Critics gave the game great praise for its plot and mystery, animation, gameplay, and for just being an entertaining game. So, to no one's surprise, it went on to be another bestseller in the series. The next year would see Freddi and Luther heading out west for their next mystery with the case of the Hogfish Rustlers of Briny Gulch. In this one, Freddi and Luther are on a trip to Freddi's cousin's ranch to be taught how to raise hogfish. But upon arrival, they learn that all of Cousin Calico's hogfish have been rustled by some hogfish rustlers. Soon, they learn that the hogfish are being held up in the rustler's hideout, the Rusty Rustler. The only problem, though, is that only rustlers can get into the hideout. Thus, they have to get together a rustler disguise so they can get in and rescue the hogfish. Before I go on, let me just say right now, if you're not a fan of westerns or western settings, then this will affect your enjoyment of this game. Now, with that said, going from a tropical environment setting to a western one was an interesting choice. Like the previous game, the mystery is a caper, this time all about rustling some hogfish and why the rustlers did it. But it changes just enough things up to make it a different take, and having Freddi and Luther needing to disguise themselves in order to get into the hideout is a fresh spin, since the others always had them automatically go to the last area. It was also good to see them do a twist on the old cattle or sheep rustling storyline. The rustlers' motives for stealing the hogfish being they want to be hogfish ranchers themselves instead of selling them off for a profit was a good and unexpected spin. However, even with that going for it, this game has a lot of flaws. For starters, the plot feels like a step down from the last one. The stakes in here are more personal, given that Calico raised and cared for all the hogfish herself, but it oddly feels a bit smaller. I mean, this is going from stealing a priceless conch shell to rustling some hogfish. That there alone is a step down. Also, how come Gruntle's the only hogfish who can talk? Yes, it was shown the hogfish are sentient to an extent, but up until that point, they never inferred that they could speak. There are also fewer suspects in here, with only 4 out of the 13 characters you meet having to be involved with the rustling. The new cast of characters are a pretty mixed bag. There are some that are fun and charming, with one from the previous game returning, while the others are just one note and don't have interesting personalities beyond their one shtick. The backgrounds and locations, while nice looking and they do a great job at invoking the western setting and atmosphere, do make the game look a little samey, since the main color palette is brown mixed in with a little green, blue, and purple. Now, all that being said, this is very far from being an awful game. The puzzles, though on the simpler side, do still require creative thinking, memorizing, and problem solving. Not to mention, it does have a good amount of genuinely funny moments sprinkled in. The Nickelodeon, Oysteroid Arcade, and Wanted poster are fun little side sections for the players, and the former and latter help further add to the Western theming. Also, despite the smaller number of suspects, the way they set up the reveal of Mr. Big is pretty clever. Instead of saying who the culprits were out of the gate, they planted little hints through the characters' actions that one of them could possibly be behind it. It also does a good job at giving reasons why the others couldn't have been behind the whole caper. And, as I said earlier, despite the limited color palette, the backgrounds do a great job at capturing the Western atmosphere, and some of the new characters are charming and enjoyable. Even being one of the series' weaker entries, it's still overall an enjoyable and fun game. There's not a whole lot of unused elements in this one, but there is one interesting bit worth mentioning. A bit of dialogue between Freddi and Luther about tying up the rope around the shark, but it got cut due to it being impossible to get the rope on the starfish path. It's also the only game to not have any character cameos from the other Humongous series. Lastly, there's a different version of the theme used when Nelson is assembling the belt buckle. When Freddi and Luther rescued the Hogfish on November 5th, 1999, they were successful in cracking another caper. In fact, in 2001 alone, the game went on to sell an additional 65,106 copies, and critics were once more praising it for its animation, characters, story, gameplay, and for being more challenging compared to the previous entries. 2 years later, the duo would be heading up to the park for what would be their final case in the case of the creature of Coral Cove. In this, Freddi and Luther are off to have a fun day at Coral Cove Park. But when they get there, they soon learn the park has been closed due to some recent sightings of a giant sea monster, and the citizens are about to form an angry mob and about ready to send it packing. So, the duo decide to investigate and see just why the sea monster is frightening everybody away. However, they soon learn that this particular mystery runs a lot deeper than they initially thought. As far as being the final entry in the series, it definitely went out on a high note. The mystery here is a good step up from the previous one. It's another caper, but this time, Freddi and Luther have to uncover what the sea monster really wants and the real reason why it's been scaring everyone away from the park, and it does a great job in building it up. It also made great use of misdirection. It tries to fool players into thinking it's another Scooby-Doo mystery where it all points to it being just a guy in a monster suit, only to then reveal, through some hints and clues, not only is that not the case, but it also shows the mystery goes deeper than it lets on. Like the others, the gameplay has players go around the town and the park getting the needed clues and items, and it does a good job at shuffling up the paths and how they're supposed to get the needed items. Sometimes it's pretty straightforward, but other times they require some tricky problem and puzzle solving. Speaking of, the puzzles in this are among the trickiest ones the series has done yet. There are many multi-part ones that require plenty of memorizing, decision making, and again, puzzle and problem solving. The Tide Pools and Mess Hall Mania are really fun minigames that do work in giving a fun break in the middle of the investigation, as well as the former providing a specific item. Just like in 3, there's one section where a character does it solo, this time being Luther. As for the animation, it received a bit of a boost here. Sure, it's mostly the same from 3 and 4, But there are some new ones done for the cutscenes, and they do look quite nice. And there is some good camera work employed, like this panning shot as they're swimming through the town. Also, it was nice to see a couple of old characters make their return here, especially with Casey, as he helps out in cracking the mystery. And while I'm still on about the characters, they have some of the most fun personalities of all the games, and even subvert some common character tropes. An interesting touch they added here is having only a couple of them appear on a specific path, so one won't see them all at once in a single playthrough. So with all of that, you've got yourself another solid entry, and once again, a great one for the series to end with, even if it wasn't planned to be so. Unfortunately, there aren't any unused elements that were left out of the finished game. Really, it's just a bunch of leftovers from the other games and the logo's color palette, along with, for some reason, one track from Putt-Putt Joins the Parade and one from Travels Through Time. The only true unused element in it is an empty blue room, but that's really it. When the duo uncovered the sea monster mystery on June 19th, 2001, they succeeded in finding the real culprit. Critics were once again giving the game great praise, and it easily became another sales success, selling 119,739 units in North America. Following afterwards, there wouldn't be another game developed due to the new heads not wanting to do any more of them, and their priorities switching over to the backyard sports. Interestingly, had the Junior Venture games been allowed to continue on, they would have all made the switch over to CGI, like how Backyard Sports did. How they would have looked though is another story. On another fascinating note, Freddi Fish is the only series to have the same voice actors for the two main characters, with Freddi herself being voiced by Annette Tatangi, and Luther was voiced by Mike McAuliffe. The others had to recast their leads for various outside reasons. Funny, ain't it? There were a couple of attempts to revive the series in the late aughts, with Freddi Fish ABC Under the Sea for the Nintendo DS, and porting the first game over to the Wii, but both ended up being failures in more ways than one. On the plus side, the series would be re-released on other platforms throughout the rest of the decade, before eventually getting released on Steam, Android, the Switch, and the App Store. Freddi Fish would win numerous awards throughout its run, including Best Children's Game, an All-Star Software Award, some Awards of Excellence, and even Family Life's Critics' Choice Award. Freddi Fish might seem like your average young kid's mystery series, but it's a lot more than that, thanks to its good writing, charming and lovable characters, gameplay with some creative problem solving, imaginative scenarios, and having a lot of charm and funny moments that even adults will enjoy. Next time, we move on from ocean mysteries to conquering various childhood fears, as we'll be exploring the creative worlds of a young superhero's imagination.